Awesome. Okay, cool. Thank you so much all for being here. As Sam already said, my name is Lakkaya Palmer. I'm a second year PhD student at UCL, and my research is on fatherhood and masculinity in American horror cinema from the 70s to the 80s. And without any further ado, I'll start now. Also, this is part of my PhD research. So I welcome like comments, pieces of advice at the end and things like that. And, you know, don't be scared to offer me any advice because I probably will need it. Okay, so the theoretical framework of my thesis aims to show how cinema and representations of fatherhood and masculinity on film often reflect society in an unmediated fashion. Sociological approaches to film theory argue that films serve as a kind of mirror which reflects a change in society. My research will be based more on a sociological approach, as filmmakers like Tobe Hooper have claimed that when making the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, that's exactly what he tapped into for his resources. He looked at what was happening around him in society politically and economically. As Hooper points out, cinema does indeed reflect the world and the social, political, cultural, and historical changes occurring within it. So here I'll do a little bit of an introduction of what 20th century American masculinity looked like and how it gained a sense of fragmentation. So in the early 40s, American society expected its men to adhere to specific characteristics that defined masculinity. In addition to having qualities such as courage and bravery, men strove to develop traits such as aggression, competition, stoicism, toughness, and independence in order to prove to others that they were truly masculine. Historians such as E. Anthony Rotudo teaches us that Americans even believed that physical and fighting virtues played significant roles in a man's identity because they built his character. Then with World War II, the war challenged prevailing ideas on manhood, in part because war required women's participation, both as civilians and in the military. As military service pulled men from industrial work, women began performing those roles to contribute to the war effort. As historian Elaine Taylor May wrote, the war emergency required the society to restructure itself and opened way for the emancipation of women on an unprecedented scale. World War II not only caused physical problems, but it also caused consequences that affected men emotionally. These psychological scars also impeded the veterans' ability to contribute to society and fulfill their roles as breadwinners. Men did not anticipate the war would continue to have such ripple effects on their mental health for the years that preceded afterwards. Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, two psychiatrists in the US Army Air Forces who dealt with thousands of psychiatric casualties, declared that the psychological wounds created inferiority feelings or socially unadapted behavior, specifically in the men. Moreover, an emotionally broken man had shattered confidence and continued helplessness. Thus, there was a prevalent fear among civilians and government officials that due to psychological illness, veterans could no longer fulfill their roles as citizens, husbands, and fathers. Now, the images of George Rose, Atticus Finch, and Gerald, taken from the films mentioned from on the slide, signify what a stereotypical good father would look like in cinematic representation, but more importantly, how he is supposed to act. He was a man who had returned to a sense of normality after the turbulence of the war, as the films were made in the 50s and 60s, respectively. These portrayals of fatherhood represented the pinnacle of American masculinity. He was expected to be kind, a paternal figure, and the voice of reason who has unopposed authority over his wife and children. At the same time, he is also supposed to be an instructive figure to his offspring, teaching them what it means to be a good person, particularly setting a standard for his sons of what it means to be a good American man. Often he is well-dressed, usually in a suit. He's white, middle class. This well-dressed, heterosexual, middle-class white man is a nostalgic view of the traits that the good American father should possess and represent, the desired societal image that every man should strive to embody. So although several types of films reflect aspects of society, my thesis is indeed looking at representations of men masculinity and fatherhood, but in one particular genre, the horror genre, as fatherhood is often unexplored within the realms of horror film theory. Whilst the horror genre has not been taken seriously by some critics because of its emphasis on horrific images of blood, guts, and gore, there are some critics that acknowledge the honesty and the richness that the horror genre has to offer. Robin Wood famously stated that horror films are our collective nightmares. Wood's statement demonstrates his view that the horror genre is reflective of cultural anxieties and fears that are prevalent in society, irregardless of the decade. Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, for example, which came in 1958, was a rich commentary on McCarthyism, the practice of making accusations of treason often related to communism. It also became a rich commentary on the Red Scare and the loss of individual autonomy within a communist system. In contrast, Child's Play, directed by Tom Holland in 1988, was seen as a critique of consumerism in a decade where children's toys such as the Cabbage Patch Kids, He-Man, and Transformers was very common in local toy stores. Child Play also draws on parents' fears regarding child safety and the toys that their childs were playing with. In the 1980s, there was a new public anxiety about choking hazards. Therefore, it's very culturally significant that Child's Play, a narrative about a doll that murders children, appears at this specific time. Famous horror fiction writer Stephen King acknowledged the genre as extremely limber and adaptable. The genre's adaptability is shown as no matter the decade, as explored, it always reflects cultural anxieties. To put it simply, the horror genre is mimetic, as it mimics society. The horror genre is truthful and mimetic, but substantiates the reason why the threat on film for a very long time was not a male threat, because he simply was not perceived as a threat, as there were other forces at work that could upstir the foundations of society. And this is why I find it useful to examine representations of this monstrous masculinity and fatherhood to unearth what truly lay at the heart of his construction. So I'm introducing the ferocious father as an archetype under which has many subcategories, like the cannibal father, which we'll be focusing on today, but also the faux father, the haunted father, and the fragmented father. The ferocious father is not just a monstrous father, but can also be a grotesque father figure. The ferocious father is a man that can be deemed as dangerous, a threat to himself or others. He is unstable. He is the opposite of the Atticus Finch stereotype of morally upstanding men. He is rage-filled. His definition is fluid as it constantly changes from decade to decade. Sometimes he is the father who teaches the wrong type of values and creates the wrong type of family. Sometimes he is the father who turns against his own children, like Jack in The Shining. He can be the wicked priest, like Father Spoleto in The Omen. Sometimes he can be Satan himself, Satan from The Omen. Sometimes he can refuse to listen or is unaware, like Donald from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Sometimes he is absent altogether, so thinking of films like Carrie, The Babadook, Alice Sweet Alice. The ferocious father is in flux, much like fatherhood and masculinity in this time period. My research explores the portrayal of the ferocious father and masculinity and how the figure was shaped by the social, political, and cultural changes occurring in this period, and in turn had an influence on society at large. Today, I will focus on one of the archetypes of the ferocious father category, the cannibal, and how he is constructed in Wes Craven's The Hills Have Eyes. Before we do that, a little bit of historical context about what was going on in the 70s when the film was made. So the 1970s in America was a turbulent decade that altered the foundations of the traditional nuclear family. Many, including film theorists like Joseph Lanza, considered this period a troubling time for American individuals who had idealized the 1950s family model and the way of living portrayed in family models shown in Leave It to Beaver and The Life of Riley. The 1970s, especially for its men, was a time of nihilism within American society, as social, political, and economic issues began to disturb America's consciousness, with the rise of second-wave feminism, issues such as the Watergate scandal, economic recession, Vietnam veterans returning home, and the oil crisis, to name a few. Given the historical evidence of men's responses to social and political issues, including the rise of feminism and the oil crisis, it's unwise to claim that these films were not reactionary, as many critics had pinned before. Horror is a working medium of film as a response to what is happening at the time, whether this is shown consciously or unconsciously. This fear was translated over into The Hills of Eyes. This, in retrospect, is evidence that horror films and visual texts are reflective of the time in which they were made. The figure on top of the slide, "Sorry, no gas, ask Nixon," shows Paul Pierson standing by his sign, ascribing accountability to President Nixon, illustrating how men in society at the time were frustrated at their current situations. This frustration that men felt filtered into their representations within the horror genre, and mostly shown and aptly shown more prominently in the figure of the cannibal. So there have been many cases of men and fathers devouring children throughout classical mythology, fairy tales, and folklore alike. The popular story of Jack and the Beanstalk, for example, I think people forget that the giant was a cannibal who ate children. Cannibalism enacted by men towards a newer generation is nothing new. In Greek mythology, Kronos, king of the Titans, was scared that his children would overthrow him, like how he and his siblings overthrew their father, Uranus. So Kronos ate them. He ate his children in an attempt to maintain his patriarchal right. This is the ultimate ferocious father tale that later occurred in classical antiquity, way before the times of horror cinema. However, the father as cannibal remains a prominent motive in the horror genre, and it's shown more prominently in films such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills of Eyes, as we'll discuss today. However, the cannibalistic father can be seen in other films that span from decade to decade, including Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. It's important to note that while some of these men display cannibalism quite literally, some are more symbolic and metaphorical cannibals too. Jennifer Brown notes that cannibalism is generally deemed unnatural and monstrous because it disregards widely accepted norms or eating practices. Brown's statement is true regarding the physical cannibal, but the symbolic cannibal symbolizes something much different. I use examples of the symbolic cannibal most aptly in my discussion of Bob Carter. Whilst he does not eat people as a means of surviving like his monstrous hill-dwelling counterparts do, Bob consumes and profits at the expense of others. There is something to be said then about men and the notion of consumption, to consume women, as well as to consume and benefit from inherited land at the expense of ethnic minorities and working class people being pushed to the margins of society. The metaphorical cannibal consumes what is not exclusively his, and in doing so, he becomes stronger, while those he consumes from become more weaker and more marginalized. In the Hills of Eyes, the threat comes from the men. Like Kronos of Greek mythology attempted to keep his patriarchal privilege for himself by devouring his children, is the same way that the men of the Hills of Eyes attempt to hold on to their power and patriarchal privileges. By attempting to do this, these men fall into the repetitive cycle of Greek myth, male violence leading to more male violence. As critics have noted, one of the film's messages regarding family politics is how home sweet home can be the place where the more abled wield power over the less abled. The film exhibits a fine display of male violence and how this filters down from generation to generation. So starting off with Papa Jupiter. Papa Jupiter of the hill-dwelling clan, along with his 3 sons, rape, murder, and cannibalize. In turn, Jupiter's father, Fred, admitted to attempting to kill him when he was a younger boy. Again, the curse of Kronos striking again with this repetition of male violence taking place. Jupiter is literally depicted as a monster, though, inhumane and ferocious. The figure of Jupiter shows his outward monstrosity, as he has scars and cuts all over his face, evoking the perception that he is a man that willingly engages in barbaric violence. The darkness of his skin and hair counteracts with his urban dwelling counterparts of that of the Carter family. The darkness of his hair and skin and the lightness of the Carter family's hair and skin seem to show the duality of the families, one engaged in violence and monstrosity, whereas the others are supposed to be seen and received as pure and angelic. However, as we'll learn later, that is far from the case. Jupiter's name is also quite interesting. It's not only the name of a planet, but is also the Roman god of the sky, thunder, and king of the gods. The names of the gods given to these cannibal men provide a commentary on their perceived supernatural ability and patriarchy in its perpetuation of supremacy and domination. He also named his sons after gods too, but gods with negatively charged meanings. His son Mercury is named after the god of communication, thieves, trickery, and travelers. His son Pluto is named after the god of the underworld, and his son Mars is named after the god of war. Now, Mars is the most ferocious and violent of his brothers and even matches his father's violent nature. Mars single-handedly rapes Branda, kidnaps Katie, a baby, and murders Lynn and Ethel. A god of war is an apt name to be the perpetrator of such horrific male violence and degradation. Mars then becomes a grotesque embodiment of the curse of Kronos, or masculine violence. Perhaps he is portrayed as most ferocious because we don't see just violence enacted by him man to man, but he enacts this violence against women too. Now, this theme of male violence against women acts as a zeitgeist for the time the film was made, because in American society during the 70s, there is a rise of serial killers, although the term serial killer had not been coined yet. And most of these killers' victims were primarily women. Notably, between 1972 and 1973 was Edmund Kemper, who was responsible for the death, cannibalization, and mutilation of 6 young women. Now, issues surrounding unequal distributions of power, male violence, and gender politics have always been prevalent within horror cinema. Psycho of 1960 reaffirmed that women had suffered countless threats of male violence for a very long time. Likewise, Rosemary's Baby of 1968 affirmed that women lacked autonomy over reproductive rights and that institutions had failed women who had made claims of rape and violence at the hands of their husbands. Nowhere is the state of gender politics and masculine violence clearer than in the horror genre. The genre showcases the traditionally patriarchal male attempting to maintain his power and keep it away from the grasp of women. And yet each time he failed to maintain and keep this power that he so desperately craves to hold on to. In this way, masculinity and indeed fatherhood was seen as being in a perpetual state of crisis. In addition to this, during this time in the USA alone, it was found that men committed approximately 90% of the murders. The study also refers to Hosslin Miles' commentary on male violence, as she calls men the death sex, as during the 20th century alone, over 50 million people died at the hands of psychiatrically normal men. In The Hills of Eyes, the men of the Cannibal family too have also fallen into the bread loser stereotype, the complete opposite of what a good man or a good father should strive to be like in American society. Jupiter's financial situation is in complete opposition to that of the Carters. As Tony William notes, the family survived by using captured technological items from their enemies, such as binoculars and walkie-talkies. The family must subsist using the technology left behind by their victims, which emphasize that they cannot live by their own means and must use the scraps that people have left behind for them. By living on the margins, the men must try to survive on what they can find, as they are disenfranchised and are the victims of a capitalist society that only caters to and for the wealthy. Their disenfranchisement then is also highlighted by the fact that Papa Jupiter, the patriarch of his family, does not have paid employment. Jupiter cannot provide for his immediate family, hence the need to murder people and cannibalize them in order to live. The family's reliance on the things left behind by other people draws connotation of the weak man having to rely on government welfare or the help of others in order to survive. For a long time in American tradition, the virtues of society have rested on individualism and self-reliance. When the principles of laissez-faire were introduced in American society, the code reinforced that individuals and corporations should do their best to succeed and find economic prosperity without government intervention. These roles included things such as male breadwinning, female childbearing, as they were believed to shape preference formation in the way that preserves both economic self-reliance and interpersonal obligation. The society in which the hill dwellers lived then was riddled with economic crisis and nihilism, and the people of American society were losing faith in their governments to do the right thing by people, as the cost of living had skyrocketed. Now, this contrasts with the perception of the Roaring Twenties, the decades of flappers, luxury, and excess, and when the white, straight man was on top of the world. However, only for a couple of generations later, these same straight white men were now struggling with competition in the job market due to women and immigrant labor and ripe economic crisis due to inflation and the gas crisis too. Now, this was reflected in other films of the decade, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm going to show you a short clip, so hopefully the sound works. So for those that don't know the clip that I've just shown, that is a clip from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And as you can see, there's a male character who's called the cook or the old man. And whilst he's kidnapping one of his victims, he actually goes back to turn off the lights because the cost of electricity was too much. So it's interesting that that line was specifically used in a horror film, again, reflecting the general crises and feeling of nihilism that men were feeling, that were now falling into the breadwinner turned loser stereotype. So indeed, it was harder for men of the 1970s in America to achieve the same masculine ideal of their forefathers, as reflected in films such as The Hills of Eyes and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. With society in the state of despair that it was in, it's no surprise to see why the hill dwellers and the Sawyers of Texas Chainsaw Massacre resorted to cannibalism. They needed to avoid starvation by finding a way to survive. Now, moving on to the symbolic cannibal with Bob. So, whilst Jupiter can be seen as monstrous, he is a dark and distorted version of Bob's idyllic, all-American masculine persona. Bob also names his kids after himself, as Tony William notes. Bob sees his family as subordinate. He names its younger members Bobby and Brenda with the initial of his own name, a practice also applied to his household pet Alsatians, Beauty and Beast. The children are little better than animals. Bob's subordination of his family and pets reinforced the notion that he genuinely sees himself as a god or their god. As Jennifer Brown notes, the two families and hills are the dark and light side of one coin. On closer inspection of the characters of Bob and Jupiter, in terms of their monstrousness and conservative rule, there are hardly any differences. Of course, Bob is not an actual cannibal in the literal sense, yet he seems to be the symbolic one. He cannibalizes and consumes and profits from others. And as Ranald Humphrey accurately states, a parallel exists between the hillbillies and the normal family. Yet, whilst whilst Jupiter and his family live on the margins of society, Bob, a retired cop, is the embodiment of a white conservative and middle-class America. He loves his guns, which have long been an integral part of the white heterosexual masculine identity. He feels lucky to own a firearm and states, thank goodness the boys at the precinct presented me with this howitzer before I retired," as he proceeds to load his gun. He passes down this backward ideology to his son Bobby, quite literally by handing him the same gun. Before Bob leaves his family to find help, he states that Bobby is in charge and that Brenda, Bobby's younger sister, should not bust his chops. Whilst Bob is hoping to become the frontier hero and find help, Bobby, Bob's younger son, happily takes on the role of the patriarchal father, whilst his father is gone. Bobby instantly starts acting like a militant general and addresses the men and the men only of his family. "All right, men, let's synchronize the watches. It's 3:58. If you're not back by midnight, we'll have to board the submarine without you." This shows how patriarchal ideology is passed down through generations, men teaching their sons to embody the central aspects of American masculinity. In contrast, the women are left without guns, powerless to whatever horrors await them. Bob also tars people who do not live up to the white masculine ideal, all in the same cloth. Again, I'm going to have to share a video here, so apologies on the switch. Okay. So, as we've seen from the clip, Bob definitely holds certain ideologies about groups of people. Lumping ethnic minorities and women together shows the attitudes that Bob holds towards people who are othered within society. Or as David Roche states, Big Bob throws various figures of otherness into an ahistoric melting pot, which confuses African Americans and Native Americans, locates hillbillies in an urban setting, and puts minority groups, the white underclass often thought to hate them, and women all on the same par. Now, it wasn't uncommon for middle-class white men to regard minorities, especially Black men, and men from lower economic backgrounds as the dregs of society. This harks back to the 19th century. Whilst white men were valued on their traits of self-reliance and resistance, Black and minority men were looked down upon because they could not survive without sharing and assistance beyond family networks. This perception of ethnic minority men reinforces the stereotypes that these people were considered as lazy, dependent on government assistance. They did not adhere to the notions of white masculinity due to their perceived lack of independence, thus rendering them marginalized from heteronormative masculinity and likening them to women. Now, Bob, a man of 1970s America, or a traditionalist man, belongs to a society that approved of his innate monstrosity. He was white, suburban, head of his household, where his word is law. And in this way, Bob became the symbolic cannibal. So the film was released in the 70s, which was a perfect time to discuss these broader societal concerns about conservative patriarchy, economic recessions, and what would happen to masculinity at a time where feminists such as Betty Friedan were advocating for new fatherhood. And sociologists such as Carrigan, Connell, and Lee found that men saw new fatherhood as a part of male liberation, a movement that was breaking free of societal conventions. New fatherhood was on the rise, but some men refused to change, as evident in The Hills of Eyes, with the cannibal family's refusal to change their circumstances, happy in the landscape's rurality and enacting violence and barbarism as a means of survival. Now, The Hills of Eyes, for me, showcases the isolation of archaic fatherhood. The film showcased how men capitalized on ideas of traditional fatherhood that no longer held up in a 1970s society. The changing state of gender relations and power, as reinforced by second wave feminism and the failure of the American government, ensured that these patriarchal traditions were ceasing to continue. Jupiter is cannibalized by society, just as he cannibalizes others, stuck in a vicious, repetitive cycle that never ends. Likewise, the symbolic cannibal father becomes a motive for men who believed in the traditional patriarchal way of terrorizing and cannibalizing people who did not fit into their old way of seeing things. Thank you so much for listening.